Hello and welcome to today's video. We'll be tackling keystones and identifying how to optimally pick or choose. League of Legends at its core is about identifying relevant information and then utilizing it. That said, what makes a keystone optimal and what defines it? Let's get started. Conquer is an interesting rune that rewards extended fights. It's a stack-based keystone that grows in power over time. So instead of taking short trades, you want to outvalue people by dragging fights out. Once Conquer is fully stacked, it'll convert a percentage of your damage into healing, which is really fantastic. You want to use Conquer on champions that have either really good sustain or extensive combos with short cooldowns. A good example of sustain would be Swain, while extensive combos would be something like Sylas or Cassiopeia. The downside of Conquer is having to stack it for full value. In a lot of mid lane matchups, you'll be outranged or poked out without being able to reliably build up stacks. This is natural because they'll be playing for their own keystone strength while denying yours. Conquer is easier to stack on melees just because you generate more stacks from your attacks. Electrocute is a really fantastic burst rune that has good scaling. The base damage is extremely good while having a 25% AP ratio. The downside to running Electrocute is that the cooldown is significantly longer than other keystones and is conditional. For context, Electrocute has a 25-second CD at level 1, whereas Ahri has a 6-second CD at level 1. For champions that value flexibility, being forced to use 3-hit combos in certain matchups can be problematic. Dark Harvest is a fundamentally flawed keystone that is particularly a noob trap. This keystone is best in slot for ARAM and only really good for champions who can't utilize traditional keystones. And this is usually junglers because they can't activate their keystones against monsters. The condition to use Dark Harvest is being below 50% health. This is bad because you essentially do not have a keystone until this point. This effect is cooldown gated for 45 seconds against the same target, which means that you essentially can never use this except for teamfighting, or maybe even finishing somebody off with a full combo. Even then, the base damage isn't that great, being 3 times less than Electrocute at level 9, but has potentially great scaling the longer the game goes. The AP ratio is lower than Electrocute, 15% versus 25%, but the main benefit is that you can theoretically proc Dark Harvest multiple times in one fight. So if you proc Dark Harvest twice in one fight, you are technically outvaluing Electrocute. Now the issue here is that you sometimes have a champion identity that wants to do damage up front and not necessarily on the back end. So it can be complicated, but for the most part, you're really only going to take Dark Harvest on champions that can utilize it, like Karthus, Jhin, Echo, a lot of champions in the jungle like Graves, but not really mid lane champions. Too long didn't read, don't use this keystone at all, please. Predator has seen mini nerfs due to extreme effectiveness depending on champion. Nowadays, we only really see Predator on champions like Singed, Galio, Rumble, Veigar, and a few other champions that really value the utility. Their main goal is to get in range, and once that goal is accomplished, nothing else really matters. Predator is great if your champion isn't reliant on keystone for extra damage or survivability. You can instead opt for full utility. The issue for most solo queue mages is that their laning and combos are extremely dependent on damage keystones, which makes Predator lackluster. Solo queue is essentially balanced around a lack of information and communication. This means actively roaming or forcing plays with Predator will pretty much always be rewarded. You just can't really escape from Predator. Now, once again, because your champion isn't capable of using Predator and succeeding in lane phase, it probably isn't really the best fit. Ahri is still a really great rune that actively incentivizes you for combat. It's extremely flexible as it procs off any source of damage while having a very low cooldown, around 6 seconds typically, but it is based off of range. As a result of being low cooldown and flexible, the damage is a lot lower than Electrocute, however, as you can see with these base damages. However, the flexibility means that you can throw skills out constantly without feeling forced to use all of your spells. This allows you to hold on to certain spells for safety. The scaling is also a lot lower, 10% AP versus 25%, but the AP shield ratio is actually 22.5%, which is very useful for utility-style champions like Orianna, Lulu, amongst others. This essentially locks in Summon Ahri as a really strong lane rune if you want priority or to 2v2 skirmish with your jungler. While it doesn't scale as well into the mid to late, it's still really good considering how much value you get from it early. Phase Rush is the ultimate utility keystone that offers both offensive and defensive measures. The issue is primarily that most champions are gated by damage. Taking Phase Rush removes a lot of your kill potential in exchange for consistency and utility. If your champion has naturally high damage or you're desperate for a repositioning tool, Phase Rush is fantastic. It's extremely hard to die to ganks with Phase Rush, and it's fantastic in teamfighting. And as the game progresses, the move speed becomes more valuable since distance control gives you access to more skill rotations, which will outweigh the DPS loss. We don't often see Phase Rush as a primary rune in mid lane as it's a situational rune. We're also seeing a general shift towards Ghost as a secondary summoner spell instead of forcing the Phase Rush keystone. Some notable usages are for Cassio, Orianna, Syndra, and other control mages. I'm actually a huge Comet fan. If you play artillery mages, the issue that I have is that First Strike is just more fun. Comet is really interesting because the base damage is on par with Electrocute early. The AP ratio is slightly lower, being 20% versus 25%. The CD is also extremely close with Comet starting off at 20 seconds. Now, the main difference is that Comet CD scales based on level dropping as low as 8 seconds at level 18. Electrocute caps out at 20. The damage can be inconsistent since it has a travel time, but this is solved by either slows or stuns to guarantee the damage. Comet is really good on champions like Lux or Xerath. This rune has really good scaling at the cost of consistency in lane for most champions. As the game progresses, it'll ramp up in value, making it very, very good for champions who are poke-oriented, who aren't reliant on burst. Now, this is interesting because not many people know this, but when you do ability damage, you're actually reducing the remaining cooldown on Arcane Comet. So spell damage, as you can see here, reduces it by 20%, area damage is 10% per enemy hit, and persistent damage is 5%. Now, the keyword here is remaining, which means that if it's currently at 4 seconds, you're only going to get 20% of that 4, as opposed to just 20% of 8 at all times. But if you're cycling through skills constantly, then you can basically repeat Arcane Comet as many times as possible in the mid to late game. People often get confused when talking about First Strike and its classification and scaling. The damage isn't that great. It doesn't really get better, it's a flat 9%. Electrocute does 30 damage at level 1, 9% of a 300 damage combo at level 3 is 27. When we refer to scaling, we're talking about the gold generated. This gold can be used for anything: damage, survivability, utility. Item progression is the ultimate form of scaling, especially if you're playing gold efficient champions like Victor or Syndra. The major downside is that this keystone is based off of combat initiation. A conditional activation makes it less consistent. This makes it a dead rune for a lot of champions due to things like range or just bad matchups. However, if you're in a lane where nothing matters, then First Strike is a great source of gold for doing absolutely nothing. Scaling lanes where there's no kill potential, low impact jungle picks, or just games that are going to drag on based on drafts are ideal First Strike games. If your goal is to actually influence the early game, then there's really no reason in taking First Strike. You could instead opt for something guaranteed like Electrocute, Ahri, or Comet. Now, if you are playing a melee champion, then you can also proc First Strike very easily off of your engage, which is why it's taken very often on stuff like Zed, Talon, and Qiyana. As a side note, melee champions get more value out of this just because of the ratio here, 100% versus 70. So 70% of the converted bonus damage. So when you do the 9% bonus, it's going to convert 70% of that into gold as a ranged and 100% of that bonus damage as a melee. If you're watching this video in the first place, you're not good enough to be using Spellbook. I'm sorry, that's just the way that it is. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing to support my content. You can also find me live on Twitch at twitch.tv/Zianni. If you have any questions about the video or Keystones or anything like that, you can go and ask them in the comments below. It's also important to note that a lot of the reasons why we take certain rune pages are because of the sub-runes. So the Keystone is a really big part of defining your champion archetype, but the sub-runes make as much value as the Keystone.